I've mentioned before that no other film series seems to have the viewing order flexibility and fun of Star Wars, or at least no other series has that as a feature, but I thought I'd take a crack at watching the MCU in chronological order, nothing too crazy, and building a new Phase 1 out of it, and I was surprised at the difference it made. I mostly worked off of the order presented on Disney+, and I went ahead and decided to include the one-shots, although I decided against using the non-Disney Plus shows, so no ABC's Agent Carter or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Sorry guys. We start with Captain America: The First Avenger. I think it's a good idea having our first entry be a little bit larger than life, as this movie is. I remember finding it a little hokey at first when I saw it in theaters, especially coming after the relatively grounded Iron Man and Incredible Hulk. And true, Thor is crazy fantastical, but that's the point. When I first saw The First Avenger, it occupied this tonal, uncanny valley for me, but you sort of negate that problem by just putting it first and letting it set the tone. Following that, we have the Agent Carter one-shot, which sees us spending more time with Peggy, which is always a good thing. I appreciate the chance to see more of Peggy's sense of loss, which we'll use to inform our understanding of Steve's similar pain later on. Seeing Peggy in action is great and fun, and it endears us more to her and lets us see even more of what Steve did in her. There's no one quite like her. And it builds on the lore, specifically of S.H.I.E.L.D., which will play a vital role later on. Seeing Peggy Carter and Howard Stark take leadership of it ties a very personal element into this government agency. Going forward, S.H.I.E.L.D. is like their child, it's their legacy. Jumping from there to Captain Marvel, it may seem like an awkward film to follow up with at first, but I think it's actually quite natural here, more so than in release order. The film continues with the military throughline. In fact, the military's relationship to our superheroes becomes an ongoing strong theme. The Tesseract makes a return here, making sure we don't have to go too long before seeing it again, which is good. This film serves as a foil to The First Avenger, contrasting that film's righteous war with this one's unjust one. Where Captain America was the tip of the spear for his army, Captain Marvel needs to stand against hers and say, "This is wrong." Nick Fury and Agent Coulson make their official introduction here, but remember, we saw Fury at the end of The First Avenger, so this movie serves as something of a flashback for that scene's flash forward, giving us some backstory on Nick Fury, if that makes sense. We learn who he is and why he even resurrected Steve. And S.H.I.E.L.D. is featured heavily in this movie, keeping Peggy and Howard in our minds, and that's kind of the cool thing here. Even though our original big three aren't together following our first movie, their presences can be felt all throughout. And then we finally get to Iron Man. Starting a viewing order with Iron Man could make it feel dated, let's be honest, what with the flip phones and MySpace references and whatnot, but chronological order turns it from being a dated film to a period piece, just like the films before this. First, we saw how the Second World War created one hero, and now we're just seeing how the war in Afghanistan created another, which is a fun parallel, especially with our protagonist being Howard's son. Funnily enough, the exposition montage after the intro sequence still holds up as a way to catch up on what's been going on with Howard's empire since we last saw him. In fact, Howard's legacy looms over the events of this movie so much that you may wonder how it worked so well before The First Avenger. This film is as much of an epilogue for Howard's story as much as it is a first chapter for Tony's. The contrast is perfectly illustrated when we look at how we went from Howard outfitting Captain America to Tony inadvertently arming terrorists. Take whatever metaphor you want out of that, which makes Tony's turn towards his better angels that much more cathartic. In doing his father proud, he does us proud. And yeah, we lose the punch of just call us S.H.I.E.L.D., but we get the fun factor of seeing a more senior Agent Coulson pop up here. I will say Nick Fury's post-credits scene feels hefty still. When he tells Tony he stepped into a larger world, we know exactly who he's talking about, what he's talking about, and it's cool to see Nick click the first piece of the Avengers into place. Sticking close with Iron Man 2, things may get a little shaky here timeline-wise. Some of you might think the Incredible Hulk should come before this film, but I settled on the inverse. It's tough when some of these entries overlap and get messy with timelines, or retcon themselves even. Anyway, this film continues the strong theme of fathers and sons and puts a fine point on the idea of legacy. We've seen what Peggy and Howard left behind. What's Tony going to leave when he's gone? It's cool to see how Stark Expo has grown, also that's a neat reappearance there. And speaking of reappearances, it's fascinating to see an older Howard. He's more tempered than he was during the war, but it's still him. Having two Iron Man films back-to-back kind of cements Tony as the anchor for this universe. Up until now, you may have felt that the title of main character of the MCU was up for grabs, but this movie settles it. Whether release order or chronological, all roads lead to Tony. As a side note, I'm not a big fan of dark version of our hero tropes. Hammer is a dark version of Tony, but I don't see how that tests Tony. Justin Hammer is just a toothless, lame version of him. It'd be more interesting if Hammer was super successful because of Tony's decision to pivot his company away from weapons manufacturing, and then Tony would have to reckon with the consequences of his choice. Instead, Tony did the right thing and stayed super successful, so he gets to have his cake and eat it too. Hammer and Vanko want to kill Tony essentially because they don't like him or because he does things better than they do. But it would be more intriguing if, as the dark mirror to Tony's personality, Tony's change of heart threatened their interests, illustrate the difficulty in improving one's life. But that's just me. When Nick Fury meets with Tony in the donut shop, we might think back to Captain Marvel and think, hey, Nick really has his work cut out for him. He's not only trying to assemble a capable fighting force, he's also looking for someone to follow Carol Danvers' disciplined, noble example. And right now, this spiraling Tony Stark is not it. I also like Tony's perspective on his dad. Howard, a character we kind of liked, is not lionized by his son. He helped Captain America and founded SHIELD, but he was not a particularly loving father. I like this extra dimension. Their relationship was complicated. By that measure, it's very interesting that Tony turned out just like his dad. Rhodes becoming War Machine in the way he does might be my favorite thing here. Between his military service and disciplined, mature personality, he's our closest analog to Steve here, or even Carol Danvers, which makes it sting that much more when he takes the suit. It's not just about Tony's friend losing faith in him, it might as well be the spirit of the great heroes that came before judging him unworthy. Although, of course, this is pretty much undone when we later find out that Tony made Rhodey steal the suit on purpose. That's kind of lame. I wish the writers hadn't done that. Moving on from here to the Incredible Hulk. This movie literally looks different from the others, especially the movies today. It looks grungier, dirtier, more real. It looks like it was shot on film even though it was not. I like having this film follow up on the first two Iron Man films because it shows the contrast between how Banner lives with how Stark lives. Till this point, as far as our heroes' personal lives go, we have a healthy variety. It's nice watching Hulk this far in the viewing order because it freshens up the superhero angle a bit. He's scary and beastly when we first meet him. He's what happens when great power goes out of control. I never quite appreciated how much Steve filters down into all these films. The reference to the Super Soldier program is extra cool, having this movie not be number 2 in your viewing order. We know that the serum magnifies a person's, well, personality, and knowing what kind of person Blonsky is, therefore, we can guess what will happen when he takes it. Although at first it feels strange when General Ross does not name-drop Captain America. In fact, it feels odd that the program is not common knowledge. But then again, I have to wonder, did I just take it for granted that everyone knew Captain America was a super soldier? Yeah, he was a big celebrity and a war hero, but did anyone outside the army have any reason to think he was more than he looked? Maybe it does track that Blonsky would not know about the program or Captain America. It makes a ton of sense that the US government has tried to reformulate the super soldier serum. The fact that it leads to the creation of Abomination kind of solidifies the theme of the noble army that Steve Rogers served has possibly lost its way. Really, it parallels any given technology that quickly becomes abused, as we see all the time. Following Hulk up with a funny thing happened on the way to Thor's hammer, there's not much to say. Coulson is great. I do think it's a decent palate cleanser. Jumping into Thor, the dichotomy between some of these heroes we've seen so far is interesting. Tony Stark and Thor start off unworthy of their power but learn to be better versions of themselves, whereas Steve Rogers and Carol Danvers essentially had the strength of character to be worthy of their power from the beginning, but their struggle was learning how to wield it. And then Banner is in his own corner. He doesn't want power at all, but he happens to have kind of the most. I should say this stinger is my favorite. I think it was directed by Joss Whedon. Moving on to The Consultant, this retcons Tony's cameo in Hulk, and I'm not a fan, really. Ultimately, it's unnecessary and was definitely made to smooth out a wrinkle or two in Feige's own creation. But we quickly move on to the Avengers. During this phase, the Tesseract has been a decently consistent MacGuffin, which makes this film even more satisfying. I should go back and say, the Consultant's placement in the timeline makes less sense now because this movie says the Avengers Initiative was shut down. So the Consultant was all about making sure the Abomination didn't join the Avengers, and then basically the next thing we see has this movie saying it was shut down. I've already mentioned S.H.I.E.L.D. being the legacy of Howard and Peggy, so I won't repeat myself too much there, but Steve's introduction to everything it's built feels like meeting an old friend's kid or something. Tony in Steve's meeting has a little extra weight behind it now that I really enjoy. I wish Steve had at least one line about Tony's dad or his resemblance to him or something more. One weakness that comes from watching this so soon after Thor is it kind of cheapens the ending of his movie a little bit. That one ends with him being stranded, separated from Jane, and their two lovers forced apart by light years of space, and she will never stop trying to find a solution, and neither will he, no matter how long it takes, and then cut to immediately we see him on Earth. But with that said, I forgot how much this movie is a joy to watch. Whedon's writing and directing is perfect, and it shows how far the MCU has fallen in trying to copy it time and time again. Character dialogue comes from the characters, and their jokes and barbs are things they would actually say. He's funny, but also sincere. Take for instance the scene where Steve is talking to Coulson. Aren't the stars and stripes a little old-fashioned? This exchange is honest and sincere and real. Maybe I'm cynical, but I can't help but think that with the current tone of the MCU and a lot of media in general these days couldn't handle it. Nowadays, I think Coulson would instead say something like, well, as long as you're not the racist kind of old-fashioned, we'll be good, or something lame like that. Like Steve being an ultra boomer on steroids, or I don't know, something dumb. As always, it's awesome seeing the whole team together, and it feels even more fitting having Steve as the leader of the Avengers. In release order, you might think Tony should be the main guy, but in chronological, Steve definitely earned his stripes a long time ago, and this moment has been a long time coming. We've seen individuals and organizations try to live up to his example, but fail. Now we have the real deal. Wrapping things up, not every film series holds up in chronological order, even maybe future phases of the MCU may not, but all in all, Phase 1 here is very satisfying. In fact, I like it better than release order. In general, weak prequel elements found in movies made later on end up being stronger when it doesn't feel like the filmmakers are winking at you like, hey, do you see that? Remember that? None of that stuff. Dare I say, this approach may make the MCU feel just fresh enough for me to dive into again. But what do you think? Are there any other viewing orders you try out? Lay them on me. If you want me to move on to phase 2 and so on, let me know, because obviously there are like 35 films in the MCU and counting, so I'll only do it if there is enough interest. For now, stay tough and stop by again sometime.